Good morning. I hope that your Wednesday is off to a good start. Mine is too. I'm here in the proverbial outdoor office, my second cup of coffee, and this is the Coffee or the Preacher mug made by my favorite potter. So I appreciate y'all taking a few minutes out of your Wednesday morning to listen in. Whether you're watching live on Facebook or later on today or after that on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, I encourage you to like it, to like the video, to subscribe. So over the last several weeks, we've been looking at religious groups or sects that in one way or another are sort of outside of the mainstream of Christianity, outside of small Orthodox Christianity. So mainstream, I would consider like the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, Protestant churches, mainline churches like United Methodist or PCUSA or Episcopal Church, Lutherans, and then the various charismatic churches, Baptist churches. There can be some significant difference, but doctrinally, there's a lot of unity. So I'm looking at groups that are outside of that in one way or another. So we began with the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then the Christian Scientist Church of Christ Science, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons, Unitarian Universalists, the Way International, and then today the Unification Church. Now, these different churches or groups do not all believe the same thing. Some are farther outside of the mainstream than others. I have not used the term cult for any of them. Even if I may believe they're a cult, I'm not using that term on these videos. That term itself can be pejorative, and I'm doing my best to be even-handed with these. Even though my beliefs might be substantially different, I'm doing my best to be relatively even-handed. And I think in a week or two, I'll do a video where I address like what actually is a cult. What is the difference between a cult and just another religion? But for today, Unification Church. They're sometimes pejoratively called the Moonies. After their founder, Sun Myung Moon, this church began in the mid-1950s. And because his name was Moon, Sun Myung Moon, his followers, again, pejoratively became known as Moonies. As a boy, he grew up in Korea. As a boy, as a child, his family converted to Christianity, in particular Presbyterianism, and sometime after that, Moon claimed to have seen a vision of Jesus. He claimed to have seen a vision of Jesus. Later, he claimed other visions of Jesus and also of John the Baptist. And sort of as a result of seeing these visions, he began teaching some rather unique doctrines and founded what was called the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. That's a mouthful. The Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. And he founded that in 1954. He founded that in 1954, some years after reported having these visions of Jesus. He spent some years in the early 1950s in a North Korean prison for for his religious activity, and of course there are a whole lot more pleasant places that one would want to be than a North Korean prison. And once released, after his release, he for the rest of his life was ardently anti-communist. He amassed quite a fortune in business dealings, invested heavily in media enterprises, amongst them, here in the United States, the Washington Times. He invested heavily in the Washington Times back in the early 1980s. At roughly the same time, or just after that, he spent a short time in a U.S. prison for tax evasion. And this was it was a celebrity case, if you will, because like everybody you can imagine in the religious world was upset about his conviction. Some really strange bedfellows. So Jerry Falwell, some Catholic groups, the National Council of Churches, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That is a really broad spectrum of Christendom in the U.S. was upset about his arrest and subsequent conviction for tax evasion. But enough of that. What do they believe? What are the nuts and bolts of their belief? So as based upon his visions of Jesus and also John the Baptist, Moon wrote a book called The Divine Principle. And followers of Unification Church, they claim to follow the Bible, but that's obviously loosely. They loosely follow the Bible. Moon said that Jesus had told him to finish his work. And Jesus, in these visions, Jesus apparently told Moon that his work of unifying all the peoples in the world was cut short by the crucifixion. That the crucifixion was an unfortunate, awful thing that happened that cut off his work. And that Moon was anointed to finish the work. Sun Myung Moon was appointed by Jesus to finish his work. Now, several of the groups that I've mentioned so far don't believe in the Trinity in any sort of orthodox sense, and the Unification Church is they are farther out there than some that we've talked about. They don't believe in the Trinity in any real sense. God the Father, of course. The Holy Spirit is essentially God the Mother. And Jesus is not God. Jesus is not God or divine in any real sense. And there arose within the Unification Church a real practice of calling Moon Messiah. Originally, Moon didn't really claim it. Later on, he did. But his followers consistently referred to him as Messiah. They equate the 400 years of time between Malachi and Jesus' ministry and his incarnation to the roughly 400 years between the Protestant Reformation and Moon's own work in the Unification Church. That is obviously very messianic. There's roughly 400 years between the prophet Malachi and Jesus' ministry, his incarnation. There's roughly 400 years between the start of the Protestant Reformation and Moon's birth and the start of the church. And they hold these two roughly 400-year periods as being symbolically linked. One of the curious things about the Unification Church, and one of the things that they're very famous for, are mass weddings. Mass weddings. One time they rented out Madison Square Garden, the arena the New York Knicks play in, one of the most storied basketball arenas in the country. They rented that out for an enormous mass wedding, and they are well known for doing this, a mass wedding with thousands and thousands of people, of couples getting married at the same time. Sometimes these weddings are to people that you haven't actually met before, but have supposedly been selected by Moon himself. I mentioned that his followers, and later Moon himself, claimed to be Messiah. They claimed it for him, and he claimed later on to be Messiah. They likened his wedding to Hak Jahan. That was his second wife. His first wife, the marriage fell apart. He married again to Hak Jahan, and his married to Han is thought in that group to be a fulfillment of the marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation 19. Yeah. Today, the Unification Church has somewhere between 2 and 3 million followers around the world. It's present in 100 countries. It's also sometimes known today as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. Family Federation for World Peace and Unification. So if you are see anything, you see church websites or names with the term unification, in this case Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, or earlier Holy Spirit Association for Unification of World Christianity, and you see that unification in there, that could be a sign that it's Unification Church, followers of Moon. And so just do a little bit of digging. Moon himself died in 2012. Moon died in 2012 at 92 years old. I think his wife Han is still alive, but even though Moon has died, his wife is still alive, and the organization is still alive and well. So with that is a look at the Unification Church, and I will see you back here next Wednesday morning. Have a great day.